My father was a longtime supporter of the Philadelphia Free Library and a passionate lover of history. He would have been thrilled to hear tonight's author, Nathaniel Philbrick, discuss his latest work, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce him in my father's memory. Mr. Philbrick grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and earned a BA in English from Brown University and an MA in American Literature from Duke University, where he was a James B. Duke Fellow. His writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, the New York Times Book Review, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, and the Boston Globe. He has appeared on the Today Show, the Morning Show, Dateline, PBS's American Experience, C-SPAN, NPR, and on this stage many times. He has taken readers on numerous whaling and sailing voyages, invited them aboard the Mayflower to Bunker Hill and Little Bighorn. Tonight, join Mr. Philbrick on a journey to Yorktown with George Washington. We know it will be an exciting ride. Please join me in welcoming Nathaniel Philbrick back to our stage.
Well, thank you. It is great to be back in Philadelphia. I guess this is my 5th time, I can't think of a better place to be talking about In the Hurricane's Eye. Little did I know when I started writing this book 3 years ago that a book called In the Hurricane's Eye would come out in hurricane season. Go figure. But this is marks my 3rd book about the Revolution. I started with Bunker Hill, which is obviously about the beginning of the Revolution in Boston. I live on Nantucket Island. And Nantucket is an island, 30 miles out to sea, 15,000 people year-round. And one of the things that and I was born in Boston, and one of the things that interested me a lot of my books are about communities under enormous stress, whether it's a crew of a whale ship that's just been rammed by a whale, or 102 pilgrims on a ship headed for a coast about which they know nothing. I like exploring what happens to people when the worst possible can happen. And I was interested in what would happen to the island of Boston, because Boston at the time of the Revolution bore no resemblance to what it is today. It was an island, a 1.1 square mile island connected to Roxbury by a thin neck of land with 15,000 people, the same population as Nantucket has. And so I wanted to explore what happens to that under the pressures of a revolution. And the climax of the story really is the Battle of Bunker Hill, but I found myself oddly entranced by the man who appears a few weeks later, none other than George Washington. And this was not the George that stares at us from the $1 bill. This was a guy in his early 40s, red-haired, fiery, not the defensive-minded general he would later become. He was by inclination aggressive, and he feared that there was no way they could continue this war for any length of time. He wanted to attack British-occupied Boston, burn it to the ground if he had to, and just get this thing over with. Several times his Council of War would unanimously vote him down because they didn't have the gunpowder to do it, but this was a different Washington, so I needed to follow him, and thus begat Valiant Ambition, which focuses on Washington and Benedict Arnold. It begins soon after where Bunker Hill ends with the summer of 1776. The British send a huge invasionary force, 40,000 men and soldiers and sailors. That's more people than there were in Philadelphia at the time, with Philadelphia being the largest city in North America. And George Washington is completely embarrassed at the Battle of Long Island and loses New York. It's Washington's absolute lowest point of the war. And meanwhile, Benedict Arnold, who is so far proven to be one of our best generals, has the performance of his life at Valcour Island and Lake Champlain. And the book follows what happens over the course of the next 4 years as Washington becomes that truly indispensable man, the one person capable of holding the country together. And Arnold decides that he is the one American general destined to pull that country apart. It ends with the with his unsuccessful attempt to surrender West Point to the British. Now, West Point is on the Hudson River, and I am a water guy. I grew up I live in Nantucket. I did, however, grow up in that maritime center of the University of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But we have rivers, and rivers I quickly learned before there were interstate highways and railroads, rivers were how you moved armies, provisions, anybody, anywhere, because the roads were just terrible. And, so water is a theme in all my books and was in the 2 previous Revolution books, but I tell you, not even I was prepared to see how absolutely influential the water, and specifically the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, would be to the destiny of America. Because we think of Yorktown, and In the Hurricane's Eye begins basically where the other book ended, with Arnold's unsuccessful attempt to surrender West Point, and then follows what happens in just the next year, because it's the October of 1781 when we have the great American victory at Yorktown. And I think most American accounts of Yorktown see it as the great victory, and yes, the French were involved. French General Rochambeau had been stationed with 5,000 soldiers in Newport as of the summer of 1780, and he and George Washington combined in New York their armies and then marched down to Yorktown for that great victory in which they surround Lord Cornwallis at the end of his lonely point formed by the James and York rivers, and we win ultimately our independence. Left out of that story is the fact that the siege at Yorktown, which was a great victory, was almost incidental to the main event, and it's the main event that I focus in, the main event that is often overlooked or marginalized, and that is a naval battle fought on September 5th, 1781. No Americans involved between the British and the French. The British were sailing down from New York with a large fleet of ships of the line with the intention of rescuing Cornwallis. If they had succeeded in doing that, there's no victory at Yorktown for the Americans. The war will limp along, and in all probability, France will have to go to the negotiating table, and this will not end well for America. But before the British can get there, Admiral de Grasse, the great French admiral, has sailed up from the Caribbean and arrived at the Chesapeake on August 30th and is there waiting for him when Thomas Graves, the British admiral, arrives. What happens is the Battle of the Chesapeake. For my money, it's the most important naval battle in the history of the world, given its consequences. Because this victory, in which the French finally defeat the British, send the British back to New York for repairs, just as Washington and Rochambeau arrive with their armies and surround Cornwallis. This siege of Yorktown is made possible by a French victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake. And so when you look at the beginning of our country, American Genesis, we are an independent country because of our alliance with another country. And I think it's a story Americans need to appreciate, to understand that the value of international relations has been there from the very beginning. Well, the book begins in the fall of 1780. It's bad for Washington. We Americans went into this rebellion because we didn't want to pay taxes to the British. We apparently don't want to pay the taxes required to pay for Washington's army, which is withering on the vine. The recruitment levels are completely inadequate. Washington has been locked in a stalemate on the Hudson River with Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief at New York, where there are more than 10,000 soldiers dug in to that city. Washington has only one hope, and that is the French Navy. You know, we think of Washington as a land-based guy, permanently rooted to his horse. But the fact is, he grew up on the Tidewater, was raised on the Rappahannock River, ended up, of course, on the Potomac, living in Mount Vernon, which was named by his older stepbrother for a British admiral. When he was 14, he desperately wanted to be a British midshipman, but his mother at the last minute refused to let him go. When he was 19, he sailed with his older brother to the Barbados. It wasn't necessarily a pleasant voyage in that he came down with smallpox almost immediately upon his arrival, but this actually was for his benefit long term, because he was inoculated from a disease that would kill a large portion of his army in the early years of the war. He understood the sea, and I talk about the genius of George Washington. Washington was a different kind of genius from, let's say, Hamilton. Hamilton was absolutely dazzlingly brilliant. He could command tremendous amounts of information and tremendously eloquent and work at a fevered pace. Washington had a different ability. He could dial out the static in life and figure out what was the most important thing for him to do. And that is and once he figured that out, he would pursue it with a single-minded determination that would make it happen. In the beginning stages of the war, he began to realize that being an aggressive general was put his army at risk. He might lose everything if he met the British in a titanic struggle on the battlefield. Reluctantly, he realized he must fight a defensive war, a war of posts, and he pursued that. When the French came into the war on our behalf in 1778 because of the great victory at Saratoga, made possible in large part by Benedict Arnold, he realized immediately it was the French Navy he needed. Because up until that point, the British Navy had a stranglehold on the Atlantic seaboard. This meant that any victory the Americans might win would only be a temporary victory, because the British Navy would immediately sail in with their ships in the line and clamp down on it. And a ship of the line, I am a maritime guy. I'm a Patrick O'Brien fan, and one of the reasons I looked forward to writing this book was the chance to research the 18th century European navies. A ship of the line. Now, this wasn't a quaint, tall ship with a few pop guns on it. A ship of the line was the most sophisticated technological creation of the 18th century. A typical ship of the line was called a 74, which meant it had 74 guns, capable of shooting cannonballs more than 20 pounds, a cannonball more than a mile. There were between 500 and 750 men on a typical ship of the line. It took 2,000 oak trees to build one of them. That's 57 acres of forest. Only the most sophisticated European world powers were able to have a significant sized navy. Britain had the largest. France had a good-sized navy, and it was a very different navy from what it had been before in the 7 Years' War. France had been humiliated during that conflict in the previous decade, her navy in particular. Even before that war was over, she launched a program of what was known as revenge. We're going to get them back. And what they did was they immediately set out to rehaul their navy. They were applying the ideals of the Enlightenment. They would create a French naval academy, and where they would study naval warfare analytically. And their professors created a literature analyzing tactics. And in the early stages of France's entry into the Revolution, when there were a few skirmishes and between Britain and France in the English Channel, it became clear this was a different French Navy. So Washington was desperate to have the Navy sail up the coast and give him a window of opportunity to end this thing. But now that this was a world war, because with the entry of France and also Spain, her ally, and France needed Spain because her navy, France's navy wasn't as big as Britain's, and to have any kind of parity, she needed the help of her ally. And this being a world war, this meant that priorities shifted. We think of the 13 colonies or states, depending on your point of view, as the jewel in the British crown. baloney. Where the real money was in the 18th century was the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands. France got a third of its exports from just the island of what we now call Haiti. This was tremendously profitable. And so as soon as France enters this, sends over its navy, which ends up in the Caribbean, where the British, French, and Spanish duke it out year after year, with no real interest in coming north and helping out the Americans. The French were here to get England rather than help America. That was the second priority as far as they were concerned, and this was driving Washington crazy. He said at one point, it's as if a chasm has sprung up between me and the French Navy. When will they come up? And, France was working with us, but they were also working with Spain, and Spain had its priorities. It had lost Florida to the British, who now occupied Pensacola. They insisted before France could sail north, they needed to get Pensacola back. And so it was looking in the fall of 1780 as if Washington would never have the naval support he needed until something began to happen, and it began to happen in the form of hurricanes. Yes, we've had a tough hurricane season, but it ain't nothing compared to what happened in the October of 1780. The chapter 1 of In the Hurricane's Eye begins with the frigate Phoenix. Frigate was smaller than a ship of the line. It was faster, speedier, smaller crew. It would act as the sentinel, the eyes and ears of the fleet. And the Phoenix had been cruising between British Jamaica and Spanish Cuba, trying to figure out what the Spaniards were up to. It even went up to as far as Pensacola and could realize something was up. When a storm hit, it was between Jamaica and Cuba. The wind, and this is before forecasts, this is before Jim Cantori is out there, telling you, you don't want him to show up on your frigate. Anyways, the wind builds, and they're forced to take down every stitch of sail. It gets to the point where they have to cut down their masts. The waves and this is at night. They've been forced to jibe back and forth between these waves, just terrifying things. And suddenly, a huge wave picks the ship up and hurls it into the rocks of the southern shore of Cuba, stern first. It's at night, the men are feeling the ship getting banged against the rocks, thinking it's just going to get blown to bits. Finally, dawn comes and they realize there's only about 50 yards between their stern and the shore. They escape and ultimately make their way back to Jamaica. But as it turns out, this is just the beginning. On October 10, what came to be called the Great Storm of 1780 hit the island of Barbados. By the following day, virtually every house, including those built of stone, had been leveled to the ground, and 6,000 inhabitants were dead. Many of the cannons at Fort James, which the young George Washington had visited almost 30 years earlier, were hurled more than 100 feet through the air. The extraordinary surge of water and wind carried a ship so far onto shore that it landed on top of the island's hospital. The hurricane-whipped rain stripped the trees of bark, indicating that the winds at Barbados must have exceeded 200 miles an hour. A similar scene of destruction occurred at St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Martinique, where a convoy carrying several thousand French troops was blown out to sea. One estimate puts the total death count of the Great Storm of 1780 at 22,000, making it the deadliest hurricane in recorded history. And then, on October 18, 2 days after a Spanish fleet of 74 ships bearing 4,000 soldiers under the command of General Don Bernardo de Galvez departed from Havana to attack Pensacola, a third hurricane struck. Known today as Solano's hurricane for Jose Solano, the admiral in charge of the fleet, the storm ravaged the Gulf of Mexico for 3 days and ultimately drove the remains of the Spanish fleet back to Cuba. With dozens of vessels sunk and dismasted and hundreds of soldiers and sailors drowned, Solano and Galvez reluctantly decided to postpone the attack until the following year. The lesson was impossible to ignore. Given the seasonal dangers of this storm-battered string of islands, the best place for the Navy in the summer and fall was anywhere but the Caribbean. Up until this point, France had viewed a naval expedition to the north on the behalf of the United States as a possibility, but hardly a priority. After that horrendous October, a different attitude prevailed. And so it begins. And I think a hurricane is a wonderful metaphor for this year. You know, I grew up thinking of the Revolution as linear, with each battle a stepstone towards the inevitable American victory. But as Washington came to appreciate it with excruciating force in that year, it was more like a hurricane, a swirling storm of forces beyond anyone's control, with Washington at the center, the one person able to resist the centrifugal forces that threatened to blow everything apart. And you know, it's amazing. Things happen all up and down the coast, and there's a whole cast of wonderful characters. Washington is dug in up there on the Hudson, but things are happening to the south. Benedict Arnold, that turncoat general, now British brigadier general, is sent to the Chesapeake. He immediately makes his way up the James River and burns the war capital of Virginia, Richmond, sending Governor Thomas Jefferson scurrying for safety. Washington is irate, as is everyone on the American side, and he sends Lafayette, the young French general who's become a kind of surrogate son for him, to go after Arnold. Meanwhile, Washington has sent Nathaniel Greene, one of the great unheralded heroes of the Revolution, the fighting Quaker from Rhode Island, sends him down to the south, where American forces under Horatio Gates that previous summer had been humiliated by Lord Cornwallis. It's now Nathaniel Greene's job to take the ragtag remains of the American army, build it into as large a force as possible, and meet Cornwallis. It comes down to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse near Winston-Salem on a wooded hillside, where Cornwallis and Greene's armies duke it out. I mean, it's a bloody slugfest in the woods. The British claim victory because they're in possession of the field, but it is Greene who has delivered a knockout blow to Cornwallis. Cornwallis will later go on the offensive because that's what Cornwallis did, even though it didn't make the most strategic sense, and he moves into Virginia, where he plays cat and mouse with Lafayette. The summer comes, and ultimately he settles there at Yorktown. Meanwhile, Washington is just desperate for news. Where is the French fleet? Rochambeau has been instructed by his government not to tell Washington where the fleet is. The fear is the American forces are just going to fall apart, and they're going to be forced to evacuate Rochambeau's army from Newport and sail away. Can you imagine that scenario? And so Washington is left in the dark. Finally, he reads about de Grasse's movements in the Caribbean in the newspaper and says to Rochambeau, "What's going on here? You know, aren't we going to get this fleet up here?" Washington wanted them to attack New York. That's where for a victory to win this, you had to have a big British fleet, a big British army that you're going to defeat. And only in New York, in the beginning of the summer, was there that large army. The French didn't like the look of the harbor, the harbor entrance in New York, and so they opted for the Chesapeake. And that's where de Grasse ended up going. On August 14th, Washington gets the letter. De Grasse is going to the Chesapeake. Washington is very angry because, okay, he's fine with them going to the Chesapeake, but if they had sailed to New York first, the great thing about naval superiority is that it gives you the ability to transport armies by water, which is much faster than walking by land, obviously. And by sailing directly to the Chesapeake, they lost that opportunity. Washington, the great thing about Washington, and what was amazed me, was how emotional he was in this year. Already, that previous winter, he and Hamilton have had a drag-out fight at headquarters on the Hudson. And Hamilton finally says, "I'm out of here," and thus parts the great collaboration of the war. But Washington would never let his emotions ultimately get in the way of his judgment. And ultimately, he recognized Hamilton's talents, and Hamilton, much to his surprise, Washington would invite him to be part of the army that would then go down to Yorktown. After expressing his anger about the French decision to go to the Chesapeake, he immediately puts that aside and works feverishly to make this work. Now he's got to get an army march 500 miles to Virginia. The New Englanders in his army, who haven't been paid, have no interest in marching into the killing grounds of the Tidewater in summer. But somehow they've got to make it work. Washington does a brilliant job of convincing Sir Henry Clinton in New York that they're really about to attack New York. They're here in Philadelphia. When Clinton realizes, oh my gosh, they're going for Cornwallis. But Washington has heard nothing about the de Grasse. Where is de Grasse? He's on his way to Head of Elkton, Maryland, at the very top of the Chesapeake, when he gets the dispatch. De Grasse has arrived at the Chesapeake. He turns his horse around and rides to Chester, Pennsylvania, on the Delaware, where he knows Rochambeau and his entourage have been going down the Delaware by boat, inspecting the forts along the way, and they're about to arrive there. They're coming to the waterfront at Chester when they see a crazy man on the dock, jumping up and down, waving his hat and his handkerchief. They go, who could that be? Washington would never act that way. It's Washington. He is so happy that this has happened. He hugs Rochambeau. They make their way to Mount Vernon. He has not visited his home in 6 years. He sees 4 grandchildren he has not met before. He and Rochambeau spread out their maps on the dinner table, begin to strategize, and then they head for Williamsburg. They're only not even a day out when another messenger arrives. The British fleet has arrived at the entrance of the Chesapeake. De Grasse has sailed out, and no one knows what happened. Washington is aghast. On he goes. Now, I'm not going to tell you the details of the Battle of the Chesapeake. That's why you have to buy the book. But I will say it is one of the great naval battles around. First, you think de Grasse has it. No, now it's the British. And anyways, it's amazing. And it is the victory that truly makes Yorktown a fait accompli. And I wanted desperately Washington to have a high five moment. We've done this. But during the siege at Yorktown, his stepson, Jackie Custis, comes down with camp fever. And Washington arrives at his bedside just as he dies. This means as the country is celebrating, he and Martha are in mourning at Mount Vernon. It will take 2 years before the British finally evacuate from New York. It takes that long for the negotiations. His officers are angry because they haven't been paid, and Congress doesn't have the ability to pay them or the will. They threaten to march on Philadelphia and get their pay at gunpoint. This would have been the military coup that would have destroyed this Republican experiment. Washington talks them off the ledge, but most of his officers are very angry with him, knowing that they will never be paid for the sacrifices they've done for their country. Finally, he ends up riding to Annapolis, and just to give you a sense of the tentative nature of this country at that point, Congress left Philadelphia because they were fearful their own army would attack them, and they felt Annapolis was safer. It would take them 3 weeks to get a quorum, enough people for Washington to surrender his commission, which he does. He's so emotional when he reads his speech. His right hand is shaking so hard he must hold it with his left. When King George III hears that this is Washington's intention, he walk away from ultimate power. He says to the American-born painter Benjamin West, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. He does that. He rides, it's December 23rd. He has a 50-mile ride to Mount Vernon. And I have to say, I finished this book right before Christmas, just at the same time as this was happening. Washington arrived at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve. And so ended the journey that began in the fall of 1780 with 3 hurricanes. And I have to just say, no one was in control of the events of that year. But without Washington, we wouldn't be here today. Thank you very much.
Did Benjamin Franklin play any role in getting the French to lend their fleet, to de Grasse's fleet, to Washington's assistance?
Well, it's interesting because without Franklin was the great indispensable man when it came to our relations with France. And, alliances are difficult because, inevitably countries have their own priorities. And Franklin was there, Washington would write him letters, and this is where Washington realized it was naval superiority. And so he's always telling that to Franklin, and Franklin's communicating that. And to just show how tense things were getting, in the winter of 1781, Washington, just to make sure the message is getting delivered, sends John Lawrence, a very good close friend of Hamilton's, who was an aide to him, but sends him over as to act, to provide what he called the military point of view. Franklin was not very appreciative of having Lawrence. Lawrence was young, a hothead, brilliant, but just the complete opposite diplomatic approach as Franklin. And it was interesting. The French knew Lawrence was coming, came up with the money before Lawrence had anything to say about it, and it didn't give Lawrence still. But anyway, so it was Franklin was a part of it. He really was. But once again, this is before we have cell phones, we have radios, we have levels of communication in which you can coordinate things. They didn't have that, and the idea of coordinating a army that is walking with a navy that's wind-powered coming from 2,000 miles away and then have them all arriving at close to the same time is absolutely impossible, really. And as Washington would say soon after the victory at Yorktown, if it's that year, if you don't believe in God, that year will show you that you should.
Ship of the line. And of course, they were designed to be in a line and sail past the other guy's line. And you said that the French modified their navy. In what way?
Yes. Well, the French, when I was talking about their analytical approach, they also applied it to ship design and building. And the British realized that the French were building better ships. They really were. And so their ships were a little deeper draft, which made it one of the reasons why they didn't want to go to New York, because there was the bar at the harbor mouth at Sandy Hook. But they were very good ships. And what's interesting is what a ship of the line was trying to do. They would create a line of battle, one ship after the other, creating basically a temporarily floating version of a fortress. And the other fleet would do the same thing, and they'd just blast away at each other until a weakness was exposed on the other side, and eventually it would go from there. And the thing of it was, these were mobile forts, and if it wasn't going well, the admiral on the losing side would just sail away. And so it was different from land warfare. And I got my start in writing as a sailing journalist, and I used to write instructional articles for Sailing World magazine and work very closely with the art director to do diagrams. And there's not one but two really interesting naval battles in this. And one of them, the Battle of Cape Henry, in which it's kind of a warm-up to what would get Cornwallis, but Benedict Arnold was involved. And it's a wonderful battle in which the French once again prevail, but do not really follow up on that performance. But it's always been confusing. But I found in archives in France 10 diagrams that the admiral must have put together. And so they are in here. And it's just so fun to see, something I did when I was in my 20s, learning to be a professional writer, to now I work with Jeffrey Ward, who's one of the great map maker in publishing, and to work with him on these. Look at the diagrams. We put a lot of work into them, and hopefully they'll make it easier to follow.
What books have you read lately that you would say you've enjoyed?
Wow, well, see, Well, when I'm working on a book such as this, I'm completely, I'm just reading history, logs, a lot of logs in this, a lot of French logs. And, Duke University claimed that I could read French, but my abilities are not up to reading 18th century French log books. So I got a great translator from Quebec to help me out with this. But yeah, no. So I read history for work, and then when I'm not, I read novels. And so I am right now. Although, can I tell you about my next project? Because that will lead to. Okay, so this deep dive into the Revolution has been fun for me. Usually when I write a book, I then go on to something completely different and learn, and that's what I like about this. But this has been a time where each book has been very different, although in the same time period. And I've had enough of blood and mayhem, but I cannot kick George Washington. And when he became president, he realized he was the president of 13 independent states that really did not see themselves as part of a national government. And so he decided he needed, through the power of his charismatic personality, to change that. So he went on a 3-legged road trip visiting all 13 states. He went as far north as Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as far south as Savannah, Georgia. He wasn't in Air Force One. He was in a coach, and when they would approach a town, he would get out of the coach, climb onto his big white horse, and ride into town to great acclaim. And everywhere he went, people realized, wow, there is something more than my little town, my little state. There is a national government. And so my wife and I and our dog Dora are going to follow George. It's going to be called Travels with George in Search of Washington's America. And we've already set out. I'm having a lot of fun. And so I've been reading a lot of travel books. When it comes, Paul Theroux's The Great Railway Bazaar, of course, Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. I just finished Bill Bryson's Walk in the Woods. These are, whoa, that's a great one. And anyways, and so what I'm looking forward to doing is combining a travel log with history and following Washington's evolutions after this war, where I think it was by no means over after the Revolution. It was just beginning for him. And so that's what I'm reading now.
What, if anything, did Clinton do after he realized that Washington had bypassed New York and was heading south?
What did Henry Clinton do? Okay, so Clinton realizes, whoa, it was too late for him to pursue Washington. The fleet had been sent down already, so everyone in New York was waiting breathlessly for news of what happened to the British fleet. You read in diaries, the fate of the empire hangs in the balance, and it really did. The fleet returns, repairs are underway, and he and Cornwallis, the big question is, why did Cornwallis stay in Yorktown even as soon as the French fleet arrived? He should have gotten out of there. Once they were there, it was going to be very difficult for a British fleet to make its way through. He hung in there, and then even after the defeat of the British, he remained, because he would later claim Clinton told him that they were going to refit the fleet and with 5,000 soldiers would sail down and rescue him. And so the repair, and it's funny, it's almost as if a kind of paralysis has gripped the British in New York. You know, kind of like one of those dreams where you want to do something, but everything's in slow motion. The repairs take longer than they want, you know, and finally on October 18, they've just set out, and they're approaching the Chesapeake when they get word that Cornwallis has surrendered. And so it's just this slow motion nightmare. And the interesting thing is what would happen afterwards back in England. Cornwallis was beloved by his soldiers. The king loved him because he was a fighter. The irony is it was his aggressiveness that probably scuttled the chances of the British Empire. If they had just sat tight that year and just let things limp along, the French would have given up, and it would have probably all gone Britain's way. Cornwallis, by engaging really recklessly Nathaniel Greene and then charging into Virginia, made possible this great this defeat at Yorktown. But Cornwallis had a lot of friends in the army, and blamed Henry Clinton for not supporting him, while Clinton had spent the last 2 years dug into New York in a stalemate. And so a pamphlet war was unleashed in Britain, and Cornwallis came through as a hero, if you can believe it or not. It was basically the end of Clinton as a military career, although it would get better for him just before he died. Cornwallis would be reassigned to India, where he would do everything he didn't in America. He'd be a great hero over there, ultimately serve in Northern Ireland, and then end up back in India, where he would ultimately die. And so thus is the mysteries of fate.
Tonight. What were the Spanish doing during all this? You said the Spanish fleet was supposed to supplement the French fleet.
Yes. Oh, the Spanish. Good question. I'll pay you later. In Spanish pesos. The Spanish, as I said earlier, had their own agenda. And they weren't going to let the French go north unless they got Pensacola. And, in the part I read, they had tried to go to Pensacola in the fall, but a hurricane had foiled that. And then it's not until the winter that they're finally able to once again give it a try. They sail in March, and finally in May, through a series of fortuitous events, they win. They get Pensacola. So the Battle of the Pensacola was absolutely crucial for us ultimately getting our freedom. This is something that's unappreciated. And then that's really only the beginning in terms of Spain's impact on the course of the revolution. De Grasse has sent his letter to Washington telling him he's going to the Chesapeake. That's great, but he has no money. No money, and this is before wire transfers and ATMs. He needs the coins, the gold and silver coins, to pay for the operation. Despite the fact that the planters of Haiti are the richest men on earth, they refuse to give him the loan he needs, because in a previous incident, the French government had been slow to compensate them. And so there is, talk about an unheralded hero of the revolution, a Spanish emissary named Francisco Saavedra, who's been sent by Spain to work with the French in coordinating their activities. He's there in Haiti with de Grasse, has been helping de Grasse in planning this operation. De Grasse says, I can't go. I can't do it. He says, if you sail to Havana, perhaps we can raise the money there. De Grasse takes a night to think about it and says, okay, if we can get it, I'll do it, and if you want, I'll just come back to Haiti. So they sail to Havana, and in one day, the citizens of Havana come up with 500,000 Spanish pesos. This is tons of coins that are distributed throughout the fleet, because if they put them in one ship, if that ship went down, you'd lose everything. But so it is that a loan from the citizens of Havana was absolutely critical for us ultimately winning our independence. And the ripples go on, because it's only when Rochambeau hears that de Grasse has secured this loan from the Spanish, does he say to Washington, so since that money will be arriving in the Chesapeake, I'll give you the loan you need to pay your soldiers? And he does. And that's the only reason how Washington was able to get his very unhappy army all the way to Virginia. And so once again, the fate of our country was completely tied up with the agendas of other countries. And it's just a fascinating story.
Thank you. We know what the Revolutionary War meant to us. What did the Revolutionary War mean to the British? Was it their Vietnam?
That is not a bad comparison. It was one of these things where, and Cornwallis would say this, Cornwallis lost his wife just a couple of years before Yorktown, and it just devastated him. And he couldn't stay in England because he was so he decided to go back to America, and he wrote to his brother, there's no way we can earn any glory or victory there, but what the hell, I'll give it a try. And that was kind of the attitude everyone had. It was very much like, it's futile. Even when Cornwallis would win a victory, but once the British army moved on, the patriots would come out of the woodwork, and the local loyalists would be in worse shape than they had ever been, because now, they were surrounded by the enemy again. And so everywhere the British army went, they could win, but they couldn't win the hearts and minds of the people. And so it was, I think that was part of the problem of what was going on in New York during those crucial weeks after the Battle of the Chesapeake, where everything was in slow motion. And it just, no one had that snap, that everyone was worn out, and ultimately, what's the point, I think, was there. And so it was, as one officer said, it is impossible to serve with dignity in America.
Mr. Philbrick, could you recommend an account of the sea battle of the Chesapeake?
Yeah, mine. No, what I would do is, read my bibliography. And actually, what I would recommend is my notes. I don't do footnotes. I do discursive notes. In writing narrative history, there's so much good stuff that you have to leave out. Just in terms of, a narrative history is not comprehensive, it's selective. And so the notes are the repository for a lot of information I found interesting, but just couldn't be a part of the plot. And there are also a lot of leads to other sources. And so I would recommend reading my account, but then going to the notes and the bibliography. There's a couple of good books, and one of the things that I enjoyed about this book was going to the French accounts. Most of the accounts of the Battle of the Chesapeake really focus on the British accounts, largely because they're in English, to tell you the truth. And it provides a lopsided account, especially since it's the French that were victorious. And so working with my translator, it was really enlightening. There's always aha moments. And I have to say it was... I am a sailor. I didn't sail a ship with a line. I raced sunfish. But I raced a sunfish in the summer of 1974 when I was 17 at Fort Monroe, which is about 20 miles from Yorktown. And so I was sailing in the very waters plied by de Grasse. And it was when the British arrived, the French were anchored at the entrance to the Chesapeake, and the tide was coming in, which meant that it was bringing the British towards them, and the French couldn't sail out against the tide, so they had to wait. They had to wait 2 hours till noon before they could head out, and this made it a ragtag rush to get out there. And for only the second time in the history of the French Navy, de Grasse ordered a ligne de vitesse, which means line of speed. Usually, the line of battle was created by a prearranged order, in which with the admiral in the middle, and everyone would get in an order around that. But this meant that the line of battle would be in the order of the speeds of the vessels. The first one out would be in the vanguard and on down, and of course the honor was in the vanguard. And so it became this race to get out. And there was one log of one of the captains, describing, here they are, they're cutting their anchor lines, they're heading out, and they're tacking these huge ships of the line, and it's this race to be first out there, and they're actually, it's like a sunfish race where they're bashing into each other, they're literally bashing into each other as they're trying to outdo each other. And so it was reading those logbooks that really made it new for me, and I hope some of that sense of excitement is projected into my account.
How long did it take for the Loyalists to come around to becoming Americans? How difficult was that transition? You think about the Confederacy, and even to this day, how much, the Confederate flag and all those things, not to mention the current political situation and the divisiveness. So how did that transition sort of occur?
Well, for many of them, there was no transition because they left. Tens of thousands of loyalists would sail for Canada. My wife and I went on a trip to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick this summer, and St. John was founded by loyalists who sailed up, from New England and New York, and arrived. There was nothing there when they got there, and they built a town. And actually, Benedict Arnold would end up there at some point. And they were bitter, they were sad, they were angry, but they, started a new life. And one of the ironies of this, and I talk about it, is that in the years after the Revolution, we had to raise taxes to pay for things, and the tax rate in America was much higher than it was in Canada. And you get this whole new wave of loyalists moving in once the realities of this Republican experiment began to sink in. There were people, particularly in Philadelphia, particularly well-to-do Philadelphians, who weren't sure were trying to figure out which way to go, depending on how things were going. It was made all the more complicated by the fact that the British occupied Philadelphia for almost a year, and so it was a spectacular dance of trying to, finally they would have to commit. But it was difficult. And one of the things I focus on in Bunker Hill is the fact that it wasn't black and white. It wasn't good versus evil. Most people in America didn't care which way or another. They just wanted to live their lives. And it was only after the British really muffed it and ratcheting up tensions that people began to have to make a choice. And so there was a lot of ambivalence, but it was not pretty because, the Patriots, the only way to fund things in the beginning was to repossess Loyalist houses and sell them. And so, it was a lot of scars run deep. I was talking to someone who was trying to who lived on Long Island, and there were a lot of loyalists on Long Island, and she, was just amazed at what the bitterness still in her family between neighbors that went one way and the other. It's kind of like the Civil War. It was a civil war, really. I mean, yes, we were fighting the British, but what it felt like in most towns was neighbor against neighbor, with one side ultimately prevailing.
Did King George III really sing "You'll Be Back"? I thought that was a good last question.
It's in Hamilton, right? Yeah, if it was Hamilton, it must have happened. Yeah. Well, hey, God bless Hamilton. It's been such a great couple of years to have young people, bored teenagers interested in history. It's just amazing. I never thought it would happen, and it's a great phenomenon. And and it's just the kind of engagement with the past that's not just memorizing dates, but engaging in an emotional way, because that's the only way that the past ultimately is of relevance to us, is if it engages us and it helps us try to figure out where the heck we are in today. Thank you very much.